This week we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, starting in the 6th chapter, verses 1 to 13. And we've moved along a little bit from Jairus and Jesus being in the community. And now we have a story of him going home to visit his family. And while he's in his family's home, he decides to go to the synagogue and teach and talk like he had before. There's a number of things going on in this scripture that kind of sets the stage for where we're going to go next. First, we have Jesus being not welcomed by the people in his community. We don't really know whether his family accepted him or not. We've got earlier scripture that says they were quite uncomfortable with what was going on, but we don't get that out of this particular passage. What we get in this one is that the people who watched him grow up, the people who, would have been his teachers, the people would have been his neighbors, the people he would have watched him help his parents. Maybe he helped someone else's parents. They were all around, and they were looking at him as he was telling this stuff, telling them how to understand God, how they were to have this relationship with the divine that was different than what they were already doing. And they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it. And Jesus was doing his best, and he realized like the energy, the power just wasn't there. There was no belief there. There was no faith there. There was no one interested in what he had to say. And one of them, a couple of them probably even said, like, who is this? Isn't this the carpenter? Like, he's just like the handyman, the guy who does stuff. He's Mary's son. We know his brothers. We know his sisters. Like, what? Who does he think he is? So there's a few things to unpack in that one. Number one, he's the carpenter, or carpenter's son, depending on the translation you get. But we get a little bit of background of Jesus in this passage, something we didn't necessarily have before. He worked with his hands. He was one who was helpful in the community. He would have done a lot of odd jobs. A carpenter isn't just as we today have someone who builds houses or builds furniture. He would have been the fix-it man as well. Calling him Mary's son could have meant a couple of things. Could have meant for sure Joseph was dead, so you wouldn't necessarily have made reference to someone who's dead. Maybe. It could have also been an insult. Calling someone the son of the mother is kind of suggesting that he had no actual father, and that this was a concern, that he had no polite place in society. And then we had the names of his brothers in reference to his sisters. Now, one of the interesting sidebars on this particular bit is it didn't take long for the early church to decide, when they decided that Mary was a perpetual virgin, they went back to passages like this and decided this Jesus couldn't have younger siblings. He must have had older siblings, which is where we get the myth that, or the fallacy, I guess, more than anything, that Joseph was old, that Mary was the second wife, and that he never ever actually slept with Mary, and Joseph, of course, or Mary rather, being the perpetual virgin, Jesus born a virgin's birth. This is the problem when we try to justify theology and then read back into scripture. It didn't really work too well, so you have to do all this jumping through hoops. And it's one of these things. From scripture, we learn Jesus had a family. He had siblings. He had younger brothers and sisters that he probably took care of, all very worried about him. But he had moved so far beyond what they knew of him as their brother and as their son that he was not at home anymore. He was not welcome. And he tells his believers, he tells his followers, he tells even people who don't, that a prophet is never accepted in their hometown. This is not a prediction, that's just a really sad statement of facts. The people who you'd think would support him as the very first people who knew him were not there. Then we move on to this passage where he turns to his followers, the ones who do believe him, the ones who have followed, the ones who do think there's something to what he has to say. And he says, I want you to go out now, 2 by 2, and I want you to go out and share this news. Take only your staff, meaning take something to help you walk, but nothing else. Don't take extra cloaks, don't take food, don't take anything that would make you independent. Because taking all of that shows that you don't have faith that it'll be provided the way I promise you it will be. That's a rough one. It's a very rough one because we don't have that level of trust. And, a lot of it's justified. But here's Jesus telling his followers, go out, meet strangers, introduce yourselves. In that day and age, when people went traveling, they would only travel to people they knew. They would only stay with people who were family. And family connections were important, incredibly important. But here we have Jesus telling them, don't pay attention to that. Go out to the strangers. If they don't accept you, wipe the dust off and keep going. But when they do accept you, stay in that house. Don't just house hop because you can think you're getting a better deal somewhere else. Stay there and deliver the message. And they did. And that is actually how early evangelism happened in the church. We have a fantastic document around the same time that Matthew, Luke's, John's Gospels were written, maybe a little bit later, called the Didache. And it is a book that includes these rules, that you go out. You do not jump from place to place. You don't stay long, but you don't ask for handouts. If you're given food, if you're given a place to stay, say thank you. Teach the gospel and then move on. Do not make yourself the center of the message because you aren't. God is. So here we have a couple of interesting, not really related passages sharing with us, showing us about Jesus' life and about what the early church looked like before resurrection, when the message was still being sent out. It was still novel. It was still hard to accept. And here we have people doing their best to share the message of love, take care of each other, be there for each other. Don't listen if they're not going to accept you. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just move on. And also, that just because people may know you doesn't mean they want to hear what you have to say. That is the gospel. It's hard sometimes, but it's the one we share. Love, take care of each other, don't make a big deal of it, and be there. Don't expect anybody to hear you, but in love, tell anybody who sounds interested.